Hey there, everybody. How you doing? Gonna take you for a little walk somewhere that's pretty significant, pretty close to my home and neighborhood. Like I've said, I've got to start doing things closer to home, put less miles on the car. Blah 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 blah. You just heard me say that a handful of times already in the last few videos, and you're gonna hear me keep saying it, and hopefully I stick to it, so I can get a new truck in a couple years before my old car gives out. And I can keep romping around the tri-state area in the Delmarva and having fun and making fun videos. So, I've got to shoot this again because I made one glaring, well, it wasn't super glaring error, but it was enough of a statistical error that I got to do this reshoot. So, and I'm shooting from my phone and not the GoPro because there was an issue charging it up recently. So I will stop shooting at the ground. I kind of wanted to save this for a surprise. Walking around the back of an old building here in Howard County. It is more or less old Ellicott City, but this little area isn't very well trodden or very well known. I mean, people who live around here know about it, but it's kind of off the beaten path. So, where I am and what we're now looking at is the old Howard County Jail. Old Howard County Jail. It was probably in use until at least the mid-20th century. The signs out front actually don't say when it was finally decommissioned. But looking inside, I could take you up there real quick. Looking inside, there are some somewhat fairly modern phones that people could talk to inmates, I suppose, with. So let me see. Can you see? Yeah, there you go. So it was at least in use till, the 70s or 80s, let's just say, loosely speaking. And you are allowed back here. You are just, of course, not allowed inside, or to even try to access inside. Pretty old, kind of falling apart here. They're not really doing that much to preserve it, but I'm glad that they have left it undisturbed. And I'm super glad that nobody's vandalized it. Although, I don't know if you saw on the way in, we are right across the street from the courthouse. And there are lots of cameras around here, so that may be one reason that, of course, helped this place from not being vandalized. But I am here today because I want to note a couple things. And it starts with why this courthouse was built in the first place. So it was built in around 1850 or so. And I think, we'll see in the sign if I get this right, I think it went into use in 1852 about. And while over the decades, there may have been many or multiple purposes for this jail, and different types of inmates who were locked up in this place. At first, when it was built to house fugitive slaves, as well as people from Howard County who were inciting slaves to seek their freedom. In other words, if you were an abolitionist, if you were anti-slavery in the 1850s, and you were encouraging slaves to seek their freedom, let alone aiding and abetting fugitive slaves, your butt may very well have been locked up in this very place. If you can believe that or not. So, point one here is that Maryland was very solidly pro-slavery. Okay? Everything is being whitewashed right now. Everything is being whitewashed to high heck right now. I, for one, don't appreciate it. I can understand why people want to do the whitewashing, as they always have throughout history. And I can understand why minorities, of course, especially Black Americans, African Americans, would like to believe the stories that they're churning out. That, that Maryland was a border state, but it was, that they're just flubbing everything right now and trying to kind of backpedal. They won't, of course, deny the fact that at one point there were slaves in the state, but basically all the parks, and I'm sorry to call out the parks because I love the park systems and so on and so forth, but they are part of this, and they are trying to give some false impressions right now that in some cases, certain states, were not as vociferously pro-slavery as they actually were, such as Maryland. Maryland is, again, a border state, so that's one way that they, I think, one kind of part of grounds that they try to flub with. Well, it was a border state, so it was kind of lukewarm on slavery. I mean, yeah, there were some slaves, but it wasn't that bad and it wasn't that much. That's horse poop. Maryland was very pro-slavery, as this jail makes very clear. Again, if you were even more or less doing anything more than having a couple passing words with a slave, let alone found to be encouraging his freedom, let alone, like I said, actually aiding and abetting this person or trying to help him, physically gain his freedom, you would be locked up. You would be treated as a criminal. You would be a criminal. And as detestable as that is the nature, that is reality of what went on in the state of Maryland in the decades before the Civil War. This old jail makes that undeniable. Undeniable. Do you hear me? Getting back to, I'm pretty sure that I've, well, I don't know if I mentioned this in a video at Monocacy lately. I don't think I have, but at the Monocacy battlefield, over outside Frederick, and I did a tape there recently. I still haven't posted it, but that part of that battlefield actually holds a some property and a farm that held one of the biggest concentrations of slaves in the state. The La Hermitage property and farm actually had 90 slaves on the property, which was pretty anomalous because most people think that, well, most plantations had, had a ton of slaves and that's how the whole South was. That's another misconception. Even all throughout the South, even the deep South, most farms and plantations had a handful of slaves, maybe 5, maybe 8, maybe 15, maybe up to 20 or so. But it was nothing like, popular misconception, or like in the movies where there was a plantation like, every 2 miles, and every plantation was gigantic, and every plantation had hundreds of slaves, or, hundreds of slaves or so. That was rarely the case, very rarely the case. So it was usually a handful. Sometimes white farmers in the South were actually working alongside their slaves if they couldn't, not every white farmer could afford slaves, or could afford, more than maybe 1 or 2. So there's another misconception. But so we're gonna get up here and read the sign, and I'm gonna read a little passage from a book as well. But more broadly speaking, I want to start, I don't mean to rattle people and tick people off, and take away their cherished notions unless they're dead wrong. And sometimes they're just dead wrong, and they should be corrected for the historical record. And that's important. It's important to me, and it's important to history itself. The North itself was not nearly as anti-slavery as most people think. That is just another flat-out misconception. The North did not eventually take an anti-slavery stance for humanitarian reasons and for better angels and all this stuff, and because they were literally sitting on the moral high ground and it bothered their consciences. That's baloney. As I've mentioned before, by now, I think at least a handful of people who have been following me know that I pretty much take the stance that, as I've mentioned in some videos by now, that the Civil War was largely the product of a technological revolution. It was also the product of Northern hegemony over the Southern states, Northern animosity over Southern plantation owners, and there being this, of course, transition from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. When that happened, the Northern states wanted to keep their monopoly. So if you think back to when the Civil War was going on, oh, the light is getting beautiful. Spring is finally kind of on its way. But when the Civil War was going on, as some of you know, the South was eventually doomed, and knew it had to be doomed for one simple fact, that they had extremely few factories in the South that could produce anything at all. So in the South, of course, you had all the cotton being harvested, all the cotton, you know, every square yard of it that was going over seas to sail for Europe at handsome profits, of course. Who do you think was making those profits? I mean, the plantation owners, though, of course, they did okay for themselves, but they weren't making the lion's share of the money. The people who were making the lion's share of the money were the merchants and the textile mill people in the North. There was hardly a single most people don't understand this. There was hardly a textile mill at all in the South, period. There were virtually none. So they had all the cotton, they had all the labor, but they could not turn that cotton into money until it reached the North, until it hit the textile mills that were all over the North, and then got sold by merchants and then taken overseas. The North was all too aware of this. Some loud dogs over there. So, as well as when it came to other parts of industry, during the war, of course, the South eventually gassed out because it couldn't produce anything. It had no steel mills. It couldn't produce a horseshoe. It couldn't produce the extra train tracks that might have gotten ripped up by Grant or along the way. Let alone produce parts that were vital to the steam engines that they did have. The South couldn't produce anything like that at all. The South was absolutely just out of luck when it started running out of stuff, when it started running out of raw materials and supplies. That's the very moment that it was doomed in the war. So the North had always had a hedge. As soon as the Second Industrial Revolution took off, the North had a hegemony over the South from the start. And there was always this animosity between the merchants in the North and the bankers in the North and the plantation owners in the South. That division and that animosity was largely the reason for the Civil War and continued after the Civil War, and was one of the reasons why the North eventually took an anti-slavery stance, because they did not want, when the states expanded to the West, which everybody knew was in the cards, the North wanted to keep its hegemony over the South. They didn't want the South getting any kind of competitive advantage. They did not want, and part of that was they did not want slavery to extend into the Western states, i.e. to keep the wealth of the plantation owners alive in the South. They wanted complete and utter financial hegemony over these people, and they wanted to make sure that would happen. So let me tell you a little, show you the signage here. Howard County Jail, so I was off by a year, 1851. Located on Emory Street in the historic district of Ellicott City, Maryland, was a location where freedom seekers and those charged with encouraging enslaved persons to run away or rise up against their masters or similar charges, i.e. aiding and abetting a slave in any way, shape, or form against their in the age of enslavement, were held from January 1852 through the end of, so I was pretty much right there, through the end of slavery in Maryland on November 1st, 1864. Might I add that, of course, another reason for the North eventually being anti-slavery and wanting to free the slaves was because they were running out of troops. They needed to replenish troops. Abraham Lincoln was extremely pragmatic in this, and he knew that it would be a big boon to the Union Army if they could induce a new fresh surplus of foot soldiers. As I've mentioned on other tapes, much of the Union Army from the beginning consisted of non-citizens or people who were foreign-born. Again, as I mentioned, in the state of Pennsylvania, much of the Pennsylvania Army and a lot of battalions and regiments was up to 25% German. 25% of many regiments in Pennsylvania were of German descent, were not even born in the United States of America. So, of course, like I've said, the Union always capitalized on taking in any able bodies that they could find, whether they be German or whether a little later on they be black, they really didn't care. They just wanted some fresh meat for the grinder so that they could win the war. Plain and simple. Almost every reason that the North ever had for eventually being anti-slavery was pragmatic, economic, and had nothing to do with ethics and had nothing to do with an actual moral high ground, if you will. Let me see here real quick. I was going to read just a passage or two from the book. So, got a new book. Well, it's not really new. It was published almost a little more than 10 years ago, but it is. I just picked it up in the Gettysburg Visitor Center or gift shop. So, unquestionably, Republicans, like virtually all free state residents, condemned slavery. But for most Republicans, opposition to bondage was limited to battling its extension into the West. Few Republicans advocated ending slavery except in the distant future. Party members roundly rejected abolition demands for immediate action. Moreover, Republicans, like most Northerners, were racists and had little interest in expanding the rights of free blacks. Indeed, many Republicans advocated free soil and a prohibition on the emigration to the West of all African Americans, free and slave. Blocking the spread of slavery was an important stance and one that frightened many in the South. But this position must not be equated with a humanitarian concern for the plight of African Americans. For most Republicans, non-extension was more an economic policy designed to secure Northern domination of Western lands than an initial step in a broad plan to end slavery. So this is a pretty good book. I'm just about, 70 pages in or so. But I wanted you to hear it from someone else's mouth than mine. This was a matter of technology. This ugly, ugly war that I keep talking about was about a technological revolution. It was about money. It was about expansionism. It was about dominance. And it was about a changing of the order and a changing of the guard. It was never about better angels and humanitarian concerns. Ever. Anybody that still thinks that, I can understand. I can completely understand why some people want to think that. I can completely understand why Black Americans, African Americans would like to think that and would like to still think of Abe Lincoln as some kind of Moses type of figure. But it is horse poop. It is not reality. It just isn't. And I implore all those who seriously want to know the truth to do some more research and to stop reading little 8th grade books and such. Anyways, that's about it. 17 minutes, good golly. I will see you guys on the next one. Signing off here.